Greetings, viewer. Don't forget to visit my website for links to support the production of these works if you value what I'm doing. I appreciate any help you can offer. Thank you for having a look and a listen. Yours, John Loth. The Evolution of Civilizations by Carroll Quigley. Recorded, edited, and produced by John Loth. Chapter 5. Historical Change in Civilizations. It is clear that every civilization undergoes a process of historical change. We can see that a civilization comes into existence, passes through a long experience, and eventually goes out of existence. We know, for example, that Mesopotamian civilization did not exist about 10,000 BC. It did exist about 3000 BC. It had ceased to exist by AD 1000. Similarly, it is clear that classical civilization did not exist about 1500 BC. It clearly did exist about 500 BC, and it had obviously passed out of existence by AD 1000. And finally, it is clear that Western civilization did not exist about AD 500. It did exist in full flower about AD 1500, and it will surely pass out of existence at some time in the future, perhaps before AD 2500. Now, while everyone will probably agree with all this, it would be difficult to obtain agreement on any specific dates on which these events occurred. This difficulty arises from the fact that civilizations come into existence, rise and flourish, and go out of existence by a slow process which covers decades, or even centuries, and historians are unable to agree on any precise dates for these events. This is perfectly proper. If classical civilization came into existence by a slow process, and went out of existence by a slow process, it would give a false appearance of rigidity to fix its dates, say, at 1184 BC to AD 476, as has sometimes been done. In the following discussion, it should be remembered that the dates given for historical periods are only approximate. Beyond recognizing that civilizations begin and end, historians are fairly well agreed that, after they begin, they flourish and grow for a while, that eventually they reach a peak of power and prosperity, and that they weaken and decay before their final end. This process of evolution of civilizations can only be studied in an effective fashion if we divide it into a number of consecutive periods. We might divide it into two periods, such as rise and decline. We might divide it into three periods, such as youth, maturity, and old age. Or we might divide it into 5 or 50 periods. The process of change in the history of any civilization is a continuum, and accordingly, the periods into which we may divide it are arbitrary and imaginary. Thus, it might be argued that one system of periodization is as good as another, and accordingly, we are free to divide it in any way that seems to fit our purpose at the moment. To some extent, this is true, as long as we are aware that our periods are subjective but necessary divisions. However, it is not completely true that one periodization is as good as another, although any system of periodization may well be useful for some specific purpose. Obviously, periodization must depend on changes in the society's culture. And equally obviously, changes in a culture must depend on the causes of these changes. Accordingly, the periodization should, ideally, depend on the causes of the culture changes. This rule has been consistently neglected in all discussion of this subject. writers tell us that a civilization rises and falls, they divide this process into periods, and they sometimes try to explain why it rises and falls, but they rarely relate their periods of the process of change to their explanation of the cause of the change. The most popular explanation of the causes of historical change, and especially of the rise and fall of civilizations, has been by means of some biological analogy in which a people, once young and vigorous, were softened and weakened by rising standards of living, or by a loss of the ideology of hard work and self-sacrifice that had made their rise possible. In most cases, little or no effort has been made to correlate this process of change with the various stages through which the civilization was said to have passed. In some cases, this softening of fiber theory has been presented in a more naive form by a simple biological analogy in which civilizations, like man himself, were felt to pass through a simple sequence of youth, maturity, and old age. In many cases, no real explanation of the process of change has been given at all, the theorists in question being satisfied with attaching names to the various stages of historical change. Giovanni Battista Vico, for example, saw the history of each people as a process by which barbarian vigor slowly developed into rationalism, the period of greatest success being merely the middle period, when the two qualities of vigor and rationality were in a fruitful, precarious, and temporary balance, while the decline was due to the final triumph of rationalism over energy. In the late 19th century, as biological sciences became more influential, these basic ideas were reserved with varying quantities of biological sauces. The Russian thinker Nikolai Danielvinsky attributed the earlier period of vigor to biological mixture of peoples, and attributed the intermediate ages of greatest achievement to the rise of a state organization that could direct such energies into more productive channels. The final stage of decay is not clearly explained, but seems to be attributed to some process of political institutionalization, not too remote from the explanation offered here. At the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, the influences of Darwinian thinking became dominant in theories of civilization dynamics. W. M. Flinders Petrie, in 1911, offered a Darwinian version of the theories of earlier writers, such as Danielvinsky. An earlier period of struggle, based on the vigorous energy of barbarian intruders, was gradually weakened by the enjoyment of rising standards of living, which weakened strife. Enunciating the general rule, there is no advance without strife, Petrie pictured each cycle as an accelerating decay resulting from a decrease in strife. This point of view, generally accepted by many of the earlier theorists on this subject, saw the later stages of any civilization as a period of decreasing strife or violence, a conclusion which seems to be sharply at variance with the facts. To Oswald Spengler, one of the most famous of modern writers on this subject, a similar pattern was evident. He discerned in each people an earlier stage of vigorous creativity that he called culture, and a later stage of weakening moral fiber and devotion to selfish physical comforts that he called civilization. As is usual among writers on this subject, no real explanation was provided for this loss of motion, although the pattern was applied to 10 different cultures. The most famous of recent writers on this subject, Arnold J. Toynbee, has produced the most voluminous and, in spite of its sprawling organization, most satisfactory theory of these processes. He is still strongly influenced by Darwinian biology and attributes rise and fall of civilizations to the challenge and response, to the struggle for existence. In spite of his many improvements over earlier writers, especially in regard to the units to which this pattern applies and the stages through which the pattern takes each unit, Toynbee's theories have several of the prevalent inadequacies of earlier writers, especially in his failure to correlate the stages of change with the process of change, and, above all, in his failure to explain why a civilization which has been responding to challenges successfully for centuries gradually ceases to do so and decays. Most of the earlier writers derived their patterns from the study of a relatively few units, and generally based their interpretations very largely on the Greco-Roman experience in classical antiquity. This reliance on the culture that most of us know best is, of course, to be expected, but has been unfortunate, since the pattern of rise and fall in classical antiquity is not completely typical, as can be seen from the difficulty most writers have had in deciding whether the Greeks and Romans should be treated separately or together. Vico derived his pattern from only two examples, Roman and Christian cultures, but most later writers had information, however vague, on a much greater number of cases. Many had no clear idea of the unit we call civilization, and they confused peoples, political units, societies, and even religions in an indiscriminate fashion, greatly increasing the difficulty of finding patterns of change. Daniel Vinsky spoke of 10 historical types, to which he added Russia as an 11th in the future. In general, his units were linguistic groupings, so that the Greeks and Romans were treated as separate units. Spangler also spoke of 10, but his units were different from Daniel Vinsky's, and were made very ambiguous, in some cases, by being based on spiritual outlooks, such as his famous conceptions of Apollonian, classical, Faustian, Western, and Magian, post-classical Near Eastern cultures. Toynbee saw about 24 civilizations, not much different from those accepted in this present book. The pattern of change in civilizations presented here consists of 7 stages resulting from the fact that each civilization has an instrument of expression that becomes an institution. The civilization rises while this organization is an instrument, and declines as this organization becomes an institution. By the term instrument of expansion, we mean that the society must be organized in such fashion that 3 things are true. 1. The society must be organized in such a way that it has an incentive to invent new ways of doing things. 2. It must be organized in such a way that somewhere in the society there is an accumulation of surplus. That is, some persons in the society control more wealth than they wish to consume immediately. And 3. It must be organized in such a way that the surplus which is being accumulated is being used to pay for or to utilize the new inventions. All 3 of these things are essential to any civilization. Taken together, we call them an instrument of expansion. If a producing society has such an organization, an instrument of expansion, we call it a civilization, and it passes through the process we are about to describe. Before we describe this process, however, we should be certain we understand the nature of an instrument of expansion. The 3 essential parts of an instrument of expansion are incentive to invent, accumulation of surplus, and application of this surplus to the new inventions. Economists might call these 3 invention, saving, and investment. But the terms used by economists are generally so ambiguous to non-economists that we hesitate to use them. Incentive to invent is sometimes difficult for students to grasp because they assume that all societies are equally inventive, or that necessity is the mother of invention, or that invention is somehow related to innate, hereditary biological talent, so that there are inventive races and non-inventive races. None of these things is true. Some societies, like Mesopotamian civilization, or our own Western civilization, are very inventive. Others, like many primitive tribes, or civilizations like the Egyptian, are very uninventive. Nor does necessity have much to do with inventiveness. If it did, those peoples who are pressed down upon the subsistence level, or even below it, in their standards of living, like some of the Indian tribes of the Mato Grosso, would be very inventive, which they are not. Or if invention were in any way related to necessity, the poverty-stricken Fellahin of Egypt or Transjordan, or the equally hard-pressed coolies of China, or the peasants of India, would have devised some new and helpful methods for exploiting their available resources. This is far from being the case. Or again, if biologically inherited talent had anything to do with inventiveness, we would not have seen the great decrease in invention by the Chinese in the last 1,000 years, or the decrease in inventiveness among Anglo-Saxon Americans in the last 100 years, or the sudden appearance of inventiveness among non-inventive peoples of Eastern European stock when they migrated to America. Inventiveness depends very largely on the way a society is organized. Some societies have powerful incentives to invent because they are organized in such a way that innovation is encouraged and rewarded. This was true of Mesopotamian civilization before 2700 BC, of Chinese civilization before AD 1200, and of Western civilization during much of its history. On the other hand, many societies are organized so that they have very weak incentives to invent. Suppose that a primitive tribe believes that its social organization was established by a deity who went away leaving strict instructions that nothing be changed. Such a society would invent very little. Egyptian civilization was something like this. Or any society that had ancestor worship would probably have weak incentives to invent. Or a society whose productive system was based on slavery would probably be uninventive, because the slaves, who knew the productive process most intimately, would have little incentive to devise new methods, since these would be unlikely to benefit themselves, while the slave owners would have only a distant acquaintance with the productive processes, and would be reluctant to invent any new methods that might well require the ending of slavery for their successful exploitation. For these reasons, slave societies, such as classical civilization, or the southern states of the United States in the period before 1860, have been notoriously uninventive. No major inventions in the field of production came from either of these cultures. The significance of this can be realized when we recall that at the very time that the South was inventing so little, the North, and especially the people of the Connecticut River Valley, were passing through one of the greatest periods of invention in history. Cotton gin, mass production, and interchangeable parts, steamboat, screw propeller, revolver, electric motor, vulcanizing rubber, sewing machine, anesthesia, and so forth. Accumulation of surplus means that some persons or organizations in the society have more wealth passing through their control than they wish to use immediately or in the short run. This is so necessary to expansion that it means that some persons must have more than they need, even if others must have less than they need. If a society containing 100 persons is producing 100 square meals a day, it would perhaps be just for each person to obtain 1 meal a day. But such a distribution would never allow the society to increase its production of meals, except by temporary and accidental increases called windfalls. If, however, the distribution of square meals in that society is organized so that 50 persons get only half a meal a day, 25 persons get 1 meal a day each, and 25 persons get 2 meals a day each, it might be possible for the society to increase its production of square meals. This could be done if someone invented a better way of producing square meals, and if the 25 persons who get 2 meals each day consumed only 1.5 meals each day, and gave the surplus of 12.5 meals each day to 25 of the 50 persons who had only half a meal each in return for their efforts in making the new, more productive invention. This redistribution of meals to obtain the use of a new invention is what we mean by investment, the third essential element in any instrument of expansion. We thus have 3 possible ways in which the 100 meals produced by this society could be distributed. They could be written as follows. Type A, 100 persons at 1 meal each, 100 meals. Type B, 50 persons at 1/2 meal each, 25 meals. 25 persons at 1 meal each, 25 meals. 25 persons at 2 meals each, 50 meals. 100 persons total, 100 meals. With type A distribution, there can be no increase in output, even if someone thinks of a new invention, since no one would have leisure to make it. With type B distribution, there may be an increase in output, but only if someone thinks of a new invention and if the surplus of meals controlled by the 25 richest persons is redistributed to the poorer persons as payment for these poorer ones making the new invention. This would give a third type of income distribution if the surplus was invested in the way mentioned. Thus, type C, 25 persons at 1/2 meal each, 12.5 meals. 50 persons at 1 meal each, 50 meals. 25 persons at 1.5 meals each, 37.5 meals. 100 persons total, 100 meals. Every kind of material progress and many kinds of non-material progress depend upon the 3 factors we have mentioned. This is as true of parasitic societies as it is of productive societies. Let us imagine a solitary savage who lives by hunting and who, by throwing rocks at game from dawn to dusk, averages 1 rabbit a day. Let us further imagine that this diet of 1 rabbit a day is just enough to keep him alive until the next day. In such a situation, this lonely hunter could not make a bow and arrow, even if he could invent it in his mind, because to make a bow and arrow would take, let us say, 10 days' work. Thus this savage has an incentive to invent, even has the necessary invention, but he has no surplus and cannot improve his position. Then let us assume that he throws a rock one day and kills a deer large enough to keep him alive for 12 days. He now has both invention in his mind and surplus, the deer. He may live from the deer for 12 days in idleness, or he may use his leisure from hunting to make the bow and arrow he has conceived. In the former case, he will be no better off, and may be worse off because of loss of skill in rock throwing as a result of such leisure. In the latter case, on the contrary, his surplus, the deer, is transformed into a bow and arrow by investment, and at the end of 10 days, he has a new weapon that raises his ability to kill rabbits from an average of 1 a day to, say, an average of 3 a day. Of these 3, he can consume 1 a day himself, as previously, and support 2 other savages, with the 2 other rabbits he kills each day. In return for such support, these 2 could be required to build a hut, to cure rabbit skins, to make additional arrows, and so forth. In this way, the new capital equipment, the bow and arrow, has made it possible to raise the standards of living for all 3. It is by some such process as this, but much more elaborate and complex, that civilizations grow, thrive, and expand. Every civilization must be organized in such a way that it has invention, capital accumulation, and investment. Loosely speaking, the term instrument of expansion might be applied to the organization for capital accumulation alone, although, strictly speaking, this organization should be called the surplus-creating instrument. This surplus-creating instrument is the essential element in any civilization, although, of course, there will be no expansion unless the 2 other elements, invention and investment, are also present. However, the surplus-creating instrument, by controlling the surplus and thus the disposition of it, will also control investment and will, thus, have at least an indirect influence on the incentive to invent. This surplus-creating instrument does not have to be an economic organization. In fact, it can be any kind of organization: military, political, social, religious, and so forth. In Mesopotamian civilization, it was a religious organization, the Sumerian priesthood, to which all members of the society paid tribute. In Egyptian, Andean, and probably Minoan civilizations, it was a political organization, a state that created surpluses by a process of taxation or tribute collection. In classical civilization, it was a kind of social organization, slavery, that allowed one class of society, the slave owners, to claim most of the production of another class in society, the slaves. In the early part of Western civilization, it was a military organization, feudalism, that allowed a small portion of the society, the fighting men or lords, to collect economic goods from the majority of society, the serfs, as a kind of payment for providing political protection for these serfs. In the later period of Western civilization, the surplus-creating instrument was an economic organization, the price-profit system, or capitalism, if you wish, that permitted entrepreneurs who organized the factors of production to obtain from society in return for the goods produced by this organization a surplus called profit, beyond what these factors of production had cost these entrepreneurs. Like all instruments, an instrument of expansion in the course of time becomes an institution, and the rate of expansion slows down. This process is the same as the institutionalization of any instrument, but appears specifically as a breakdown of one of the 3 necessary elements of expansion. The one that usually breaks down is the third: application of surplus to new ways of doing things. In modern terms, we say that the rate of investment decreases. If this decrease is not made up by reform or circumvention, the 2 other elements, invention and accumulation of surplus, also begin to break down. This decrease in the rate of investment occurs for many reasons, of which the chief one is that the social group controlling the surplus ceases to apply it to new ways of doing things, because they have a vested interest in the old ways of doing things. They have no desire to change a society in which they are the supreme group. Moreover, by a natural and unconscious self-indulgence, they begin to apply the surplus they control to non-productive but ego-satisfying purposes, such as ostentatious display, competition for social honors, or prestige, construction of elaborate residences, monuments, or other structures, and other expenditures which may distribute the surpluses to consumption but do not provide more effective methods of production. When the instrument of expansion in a civilization becomes an institution, tension increases. In this case, we call this tension of evolution. The society as a whole has become adapted to expansion. The mass of the population expect and desire it. A society that has an instrument of expansion expands for generations, even for centuries. People's minds become adjusted to expansion. If they are not better off each year than they were the previous year, or if they cannot give their children more than they themselves started with, they become disappointed, restless, and perhaps bitter. At the same time, the society itself, after generations of expansion, is organized for expansion and undergoes acute stresses if expansion slows up. The nature of these organizational stresses and tensions arising from a decrease in the rate of a society's expansion can be seen most clearly in contemporary Western civilization. In this society, the economic system produces three kinds of goods. A. Consumers' goods and services. B. Capital goods, which cannot be consumed but which can be used to make consumers' goods. And C. Government goods and services, including armaments. In producing each kind of goods, the factors of production, such as land, labor, materials, capital, managerial skills, entrepreneurial enterprise, legal fees, distribution costs, and so forth, must be used and paid for. These costs, including profits for entrepreneurs, have a double aspect. On the one side, they represent the costs for producing the goods, and thus determine the final selling price of the goods. This must be sufficiently high to cover these costs. But, on the other hand, these costs represent the incomes of those who receive them, and thus represent the purchasing power available to buy the goods offered for sale. If we look for a moment only at the flow of consumers' goods, we see that this flow of goods is offered for sale at a price that, by just covering the costs of the goods, is just equivalent to the purchasing power distributed to the economic community as incomes available for buying these goods. But of course, some incomes are saved. These savings reduce the flow of purchasing power below the level of the flow of consumers' goods at prices sufficient to cover costs of these goods. Thus, there is not sufficient purchasing power available to buy the goods being offered at the price being asked, and either goods must go unsold or prices must fall. Unless the money which was held back as savings appears in the market as purchasing power for consumers' goods. Traditionally, this reappearance of savings as purchasing power in the market occurred through investment, that is, as expenditures for the factors of production, to be used to make capital goods. This process provided the purchasing power needed to permit the flow of consumers' goods to go to consumers, because investment distributed rent, salaries, wages, interest, profits, and such to the community, to form incomes, and thus available purchasing power, but did not demand purchasing power from the economic community, because the producers' goods created by these expenditures were not offered for sale to consumers, as consumers' goods were, but, if sold at all, were merely exchanged for the savings of investors. This whole relationship means that our modern economic system cannot produce and consume what it produces unless it also invests, that is, expands. After centuries of expansion, our society is now organized so that it cannot subsist. It must expand or it will collapse. This relationship might be expressed in the rule that, Unless savings are invested in producers' goods, there will not be sufficient purchasing power to buy the consumer's goods that are being produced. Of course, as this problem has become increasingly acute in the contemporary period, a third factor has intervened: government spending. Such government spending provides purchasing power just as investment does. When the factors of production are mobilized at government cost to make a nuclear submarine, the community obtains incomes available as purchasing power, and no subsequent claim on this purchasing power is made by government action, since the submarine is not offered for sale. Of course, insofar as this government spending is covered by taxes levied on consumers' purchasing power, there is no net increase in such purchasing power, but a considerable part of government spending is covered by taxes on savings, and thus operates like investment, or is not covered by taxes at all, and thus represents a net increase in purchasing power, an inflationary increase when savings are being invested fully. This rather complicated example of how an expanding society can become so organized for expansion that it enters upon an acute crisis, if the expansion rate decreases, is worth analyzing, because somewhat similar crises occur in all civilizations when the rate of expansion decreases. And such decrease is the chief result of the institutionalization of the instrument of expansion, something that occurs in every civilization. We shall see many examples of this, and of the varied ways this process occurs when we make a more detailed analysis of the evolution of various civilizations. Our tentative definition of a civilization was a producing society that has writing and city life. This definition is imperfect because it is descriptive rather than analytical. It is also imperfect because it is not completely true. Western civilization, about AD 970, had almost no city life, but still was a stage in a civilization. And Andean civilization, even under the Inca Empire, had no writing, but clearly was a civilization. It is now possible to offer a better, if not perfect, definition of a civilization: a producing society with an instrument of expansion. Before we go on to examine the consequences when an instrument of expansion becomes an institution, we might point out that the surplus-creating organization that is such an essential part of any instrument of expansion does not need to be the only surplus-creating organization in the society. In all societies, there are other, less significant surplus-creating organizations than the one we have considered part of the instrument of expansion. In Mesopotamian civilization, the significant surpluses were accumulated by the Sumerian priesthood from tithes and its own profits. But there can be no doubt that private persons were accumulating surpluses from profits of private enterprise, or from the earnings of privately owned slaves, or even from voluntary restrictions on their own consumption. These kinds of surplus accumulation may be found in any civilization, no matter what preponderance may exist for its own instrument of expansion. In 1850, when Western civilization was most completely organized on the basis of private profit, surplus was undoubtedly being accumulated and invested from government taxes or from private slavery, and we would not be surprised if the most socialistic civilizations, like the Andean under the Incas or the Russian under the Soviets, had a certain amount of private accumulation from profits. These variant and incidental types of surplus accumulation are usually of little significance in a civilization, not only for their relatively small volume of savings, but even more because they are not usually expended in productive investment, but rather are likely to end up in luxury expenditures, and are, thus little more than postponed or transferred consumption. In theory, however, it must be admitted that our statement that every civilization has an instrument of expansion could well be understood to mean that a civilization has at least one such instrument, except for one dubious case. We do not know of any civilization in its prime of life that has had more than one significant surplus-creating organization. We have said that an instrument of expansion, like all instruments, becomes an institution, and that as a result the rate of expansion begins to decline. This institutionalization of the organization of expansion, which usually takes the form of a decreasing rate of investment, rather than of a decrease in either invention or in accumulation of surplus, leads to a crisis. This crisis, which we have called increasing tension of evolution, arises from the clash between the decreasing rate of expansion on one hand and the fact that people's minds and the organization of the society are arranged for expansion, on the other hand. Reserving until later our detailed examination of the forms this crisis takes, we might point out here that it usually gives rise to conflicts between the vested interest groups that control the uninvested accumulations of surplus, because they control the surplus-creating organization in the society, and are sufficiently satisfied with the existing social organization to desire no change, and the great mass of the population who are discontented at the dwindling prospects of expansion. The growing tension of evolution and the clashes it engenders can result in one of the three possible outcomes to the crises. These are 1. Reform, 2. Circumvention, or 3. Reaction. We speak of reform when the organization of expansion is rearranged so that it ceases to be an institution and becomes an instrument once more. We speak of circumvention when the vested interest groups are left with much of their privileges intact, and when a new instrument of expansion, especially a new surplus accumulating instrument, grows up alongside the older institution and takes over the latter's expansive functions. We speak of reaction when the privileged vested interest groups are able to prevent either reform or circumvention, and in consequence, the rate of expansion continues to decrease. If the outcome is reform or circumvention, the civilization once again has an instrument of expansion, and the rate of expansion increases once again. If the outcome is reaction, the decline becomes chronic. There have been several cases where a civilization has succeeded in obtaining reform or circumvention of its institution of expansion, as we shall see in our detailed examination of the process of evolution in individual civilizations. The clearest case to be found is the evolution of our Western civilization, where both circumvention and reform have occurred. As a result, Western civilization has had three periods of expansion. The first, about 970 to 1270. The second, about 1420 to 1650. And the third, about 1725 to 1929. The instrument of expansion in the first was feudalism, which became institutionalized into chivalry. This was circumvented by a new instrument of expansion that we might call commercial capitalism. When this organization became institutionalized into mercantilism, it was reformed into industrial capitalism, which became the instrument of expansion of the third age of expansion in the history of Western civilization. By 1930, this organization had become institutionalized into monopoly capitalism, and the society was, for the third time, in a major era of crises. A detailed analysis of these changes will be provided later. The process that we have described which we shall call the institutionalization of an instrument of expansion, will help us to understand why civilizations rise and fall. By a close examination of this process, it becomes possible to divide the history of any civilization into successive stages. We have said that these divisions are largely arbitrary and subjective and could be made in any convenient number of stages. We shall divide the process into 7 stages, since this permits us to relate our divisions conveniently to the process of rise and fall. These 7 stages we shall name as follows: 1. Mixture. 2. Gestation. 3. Expansion. 4. Age of conflict. 5. Universal empire. 6. Decay. 7. Invasion. If you enjoyed this recording, you can find more and support the production of these works at my website, johnlothe.wordpress.com. That's www.johnlothe.wordpress.com. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, John Lothe.